Lastly, we're going to get into encoding some more in this section about generation effect and spacing effect and consolidation, and then finish long-term memory by talking about those non-declarative systems. All right, so we've already talked about you need to be paying attention and you need to be elaborating. So how can I do that more? A generation effect is when you learn better because you came up with the information. So if we give people a list of words, cat, cheese, lost, and ask them to come up with a way to study it on their own, mouse, cheese whiz, right, and lost found, I'm going to remember that information better because I came up with the cues and not just something random. So the generation effect is when you come up with the information to remember, so you generate it. The spacing effect we've talked about a little bit before, but encoding across multiple trials, so studying across multiple days, is better than cramming it all in the same night. Okay, so the generation effect, again, is when you are remembering things better that you generated rather than just simply memorized. And what happened was they gave people a list of word pairs that they had to learn. So I gave you lost, found, train station. Or they gave you lost and train and you came up with your own words. And so unsurprisingly, people were much better at the ones where they came up with their own words. Okay, so you're generating from memory something related, and so that puts those two things tied together. It makes you much better at it. And why? Because it's a lot of elaboration, which is pretty much the answer to everything, elaboration, and it's a lot of attention for you to be able to do that sort of task. So it's two things at once. For the spacing effect, masked practice is when you are studying everything at once. So you do all of your cramming into one night versus distributed practice where you are spacing it out between trials. And you're much better at distributed practice. I'm sorry to tell you this, and I know everybody knows better, but it never seems to make a difference when I tell students don't cram. It still happens. So how do we study the spacing effect? Like, why does the spacing effect happen? Okay. So Ebbinghaus was one of the first people to really study this, and he will get more into what he's sort of famous for, which is learning curves and how people forget. And so he said that with enough repetitions and spacing those repetitions, you're going to do better than if you try and do all the repetitions at the same time. So his argument was, do it across time. That's better than all at once. Why? Encoding variability. So each time you study that is separated by something else in the middle, you're encoding different aspects of the stimulus, and so you have more options to remember something. So if I am trying to remember the spacing effect, I can encode it now, encode it next week, encode it 3 weeks from now. I'm going to remember it better because I've got all three of those time points in my episodic memory to help me remember what that thing is. So having multiple study sessions essentially ensures that you have multiple episodic memories, which are all different ways to get at that memory. Alright, so here's some generation effect stuff. They asked people to read words up here, so that's these light blue bars. Come on now. And they read unhappy, sad, pad, sad. So they were either synonyms or rhymes. People are a little better at synonyms, check, because they're semantically related than they are rhymes. So the difference between synonym and rhyme here is actually levels of processing, right? Because I'm better at things that are deeper levels of processing than rhyming. Okay. And then in the generate condition, they gave people the first letter, and look how much better they are, even though they pretty much told you what word they wanted you to pick. So unhappy, sad. And then in the rhyme condition, you were told you had to rhyme it. So pad, sad. They made them the same pairs. So this is not even that people are trying to remember things that are like personally important to them because they came up with the words. We pretty much biased you towards a specific word, but you're getting these big differences between read and generate. And then kind of awesome, you get these differences between synonyms and rhymes. So we're better at synonyms than rhymes. So all of that summed up. Elaboration is your friend. Okay, so basically encoding relies on attention and elaboration. Elaboration across time, generation is elaboration, and then the encoding specificity is across time kind of thing. So what all that is together is called binding. Binding is when you take all the different pieces of an event and combine them into one memory representation. So my understanding of dog, if you will, is all these different events bound together. And so the medial temporal lobe, or the hippocampus, is where all of that happens. And so the prefrontal cortex is the paying attention area, and the hippocampus is the remember it forever area. And we talked about how this is sort of your refrigerator. If you shake the fridge too hard, you get in a car accident, you get in some sort of head trauma, you may forget some of the memories that were still trying to be bound together. All right, so looking at the different types of cortex information. So the parahippocampal cortex back here, so look how big ours are versus monkeys, right? And then the side views here. And so these are just ways to look at the medial temporal lobe system between us and monkeys. All right, so if we do some brain scans, people are trying to remember episodic information. You get the prefrontal cortex here, and then you get the where is it in space system, you get the mental image back here in the occipital lobe, you get the what is it system, right? And then bam, it all ends up here in the hippocampus. Okay. And so they show you the little hippocampus piece here. That's encoding. So look at all the different places involved in encoding. And man, that 10% rule seems really silly now, right? So just encoding what color shirt I'm wearing involves all of these systems. Later, if I ask you to retrieve information, you're just going to get it from back here and then a little bit in the hippocampus. This picture's kind of tiny, but you can see there's less activation. Okay. And then as that partial cue, so a partial reminder of what happened goes on, what happens is the same systems activate, but sort of in reverse order. So as the hippocampus goes, oh yeah, I remember that thing, it sends that information out to the areas that are able to put all that together. So the hippocampus really isn't where memory is stored. It's just where it's like, oh, it's this thing. You over here, remember this? You over here, remember this? And all those parts of the brain help put together that pattern. So remember, we talked about memory being patterns of neural activity. So the hippocampus is really sort of saying, you and you and you and you equals memory. So the last piece here for this section is about consolidation. And the binding issue is how we put everything together into one mental picture. It's also called consolidation, where those memory representations that have been bound together become more stable. And this is when it moves from the hippocampus, your jello is solid enough to the sort of integrated across the brain, and so it's less dependent on the hippocampus and is more permanent. So this is where sort of permanent memory. Binding is sort of the process that goes on to make it permanent. So a little bit of evidence for consolidation from HM, some other amnesic patients. Once they removed his medial temporal lobes, he could still remember lots of things that had happened to him in his past, but he couldn't remember the things right up on the surgery. And that's why I said it takes the fridge a while to make the Jell-O, because if you take out the fridge, that stuff that was still cooking is no longer there. So the hippocampus is necessary for retrieving unconsolidated memories, so not solid Jell-O. But once they're consolidated, you don't really need the hippocampus anymore. So you can remember all of the events before that. So that's one reason why memento is not totally an accurate representation, because there are lots of memories. He remembers everything right up to the accident, and that's actually probably not how that would happen. He wouldn't remember the event that had happened because he would have lost that memory because it was still consolidating in the medial temporal lobe. All right, end of story for that system. Moving on to the non-declarative systems. All that stuff from 8.2 to now are declarative memory systems, things we have conscious control over. In the non-declarative systems, we're going to talk about priming, because I think priming is super cool. My dissertation was on priming. Perceptual and conceptual priming, and then some other forms of non-declarative memory. So skill learning, which is considered procedural memory. So if you know how to type or play a musical instrument or even write, that's skill learning. Habit memory and conditioned associations, not a whole lot on those because that's a whole nother course on learning systems. So priming is super neat to me because it's one of the most studied non-declarative implicit systems that really elucidates what's going on when we are not paying attention. Right? So let's start with perceptual priming. So perceptual priming is when we see something and then we see something familiar that is very similar, we're faster at the similar item because we've seen the first one. So if I show you a green circle and then I show you a green square, because they're both green, we're faster at the second one because of that perceptual overlap. So priming is like sort of like, if you think about subliminal advertising where you're sort of ready to learn something, priming is the idea that the second time you see something, you're faster because you've already done it once, okay, or at least something close. Priming has been observed across all sorts of things, vision, hearing, touch, and so it is, it's a big part of our perceptual representation systems and sort of an unintentional learning. All right. So amnesia that results from injury to medial temporal lobes. Okay, so epilepsy, there's encephalitis, there's Korsakoff syndrome, which is severe alcoholism. They still show perceptual priming. So even if I have a broken hippocampus, I can still have priming. So priming has to be separate from the declarative system because I just spent 20 minutes convincing you the declarative system was in the hippocampus. So it must be separate things. And then there's this idea of repetition suppression, where what happens is as you start to see the same things over and over and over again, you get bored. So your brain doesn't like to think very hard, right? And if I'm seeing the same thing, yada-da-yada-da-yada, your neurons stop firing. They get bored. Don't want to do it anymore. So That's sort of the opposite of priming, where seeing it multiple times actually makes you worse because you're bored. All right, so if I give people several words and I'm asking them about the font, okay, that makes this perceptual. Look at amnesic patients get about 4, and normal patients get about 5. So we're really doing the same, right? But then if you look at this particular patient, MS, he does not have any perceptual priming. So there's this big drop here. Bam! Okay, amnesic patients being more like HM. So there's something about his symptoms that show that his brain parts that are broken control priming versus the episodic systems. Okay, a normal control again is way up here. So this occipital area back here is what was broken, and they removed the right occipital cortex. And I can't remember why, but they did. Okay. And so it seems to imply that perceptual priming is in the occipital cortex, because you've got all these people up here and way up here that are doing just fine, and then he's way down here, and priming isn't occurring. That shouldn't surprise you because we've already talked a lot about the occipital cortex being the visual system. Moving on to conceptual priming, and this is what my research is on just a little bit, is thinking about the meaning of a word makes you better at a second word. So if I show you doctor and say, is this a word? You go, yes, doctor is a word. Wow, this study's boring. And then I'll show you the word nurse, and you go, yes, nurse is also a word. Really, are you having me do this? You are much faster at nurse because I showed you doctor first, because they're related through meaning, through semantics. And that's unintentional. So you are getting a bump, a facilitation in what you're trying to do just because they're related, but now meaning and not visual. Okay. Most of that activation is in the frontal lobe, which is a little bit Broca's, and the temporal lobe, because that's a lot of language processing. And the idea is that when I activate that first word, activation spreads. So I've got doctor, and oh, what are all the things related to doctor? And so I hit nurse because it's related to doctor. So the we don't like to think hard. Priming helps us conserve energy because I've already got that one thing activated. Well, this one's likely to come up next. Okay. You see that in understanding of sentence completion tasks. And so if I ask you, the janitor mopped the floor with the, people have an expectation of what word is next. If you say bleach, you could say mop, but not a lot of people say lawnmower or solvent, which is a perfectly good word, but sort of weird. So priming tells us what word should be next in that sort of sentence. Okay. The category exemplar generation task is when I ask you to say, tell me a dog, you can tell me a dog. So you're faster because I gave you that category label first. So some other types of non-declarative memory. Skill learning, which is really about expertise. So I'm going to do more of that in the expertise section. Habit memory, and then operant and classical conditioning. Okay, so skill learning, we're going to move to expertise. Right now, we're going to talk about habit memory. And so the non-declarative system really uses a whole bunch of what's called the probabilistic classification. And so this is really statistical learning in our environment. So we are active processors of our world. And when things become habit, they're very common. The probability of this thing leading to that thing is very high. We will assimilate that information as a way to predict the relationships between things. So this is like you meet a friend for lunch and they're late. So it might be me, I'm late to everything. And they're late, but you're not going to worry because they're always late. right? So it's a judgment on the likelihood of events. If you're meeting a friend for lunch that's never late, you might start to worry about them. And that is unconscious. You could bring that to conscious memory. Well, I'm worried because they're never late to anything. But the first activation of that worry is sort of implicit. Okay. So what you do is you give participants a list of cues. So here is this thing. What do you expect to have happen? And if you repeat that a bunch of times, people will sort of unintentionally pick up on the fact that with these cues, this is more likely, and with these cues, this is more likely, which is the same way children learn categories. That sort of memory is controlled by the basal ganglia. Okay. As you get more and more of these memories, that becomes more and more activated because it sort of moves from declarative memory to habit memory. So it starts as habit memory. Hey, you were late that last time. And it starts as declarative memory. You were late. And it slowly moves into habit memory, which is also very tied to the skill learning and expertise. So as we get good at something, our brain does less of the declarative sort of memory because it's too much work. All right, and to end this section on conditioned associates, so conditioning, which is classical conditioning or maybe operant conditioning, is also very similar to habit learning because we start to realize that two stimuli are related to each other. So you have an unconditioned stimulus, and then it gets tied to a conditioned stimulus that predicts that unconditioned stimulus. So if you are used to the bell ringing at the end of class, that bell becomes a predictor of the unconditioned stimulus, which is like, freedom, get me out of here. Okay. For us faculty, we sort of dread faculty meetings, right? And so the conditioned stimulus of it being Friday afternoon, oh no, I have to go to another one of these things, brings upon that unconditioned stimulus, the dread of having to sit through one of these boring meetings. And so that's called a conditioned association, and they have to appear a bunch together. Well, it seems like, yeah, I've heard about classical conditioning 100 times, whatever, tell me something new. The way that language works really applies to this. So if I say peanut, the almost automatic response is butter, because we see them so often together, peanut, butter. But if you put those two in the same sentence, I had peanut and butter, you're like, ooh, gross, buttered peanuts, that's weird. But if I said I had peanut butter, that is sort of a conditioned association. I've learned that those two things together mean something else than when they're apart. So to sum everything up from long-term memory, two systems, declarative, non-declarative. Declarative system, semantic and episodic. The non-declarative system has priming, skill learning, which we'll cover in the expertise section, skill learning, brain fart, habit association, and conditioned associations.